The golden morning light streamed through the mansion's large windows, reflecting off the impeccable furniture in the entrance hall. The silence of the house was broken only by the distant noise of the cleaning crew starting their duties. On the staff floor, Maria had been up for hours. Her alarm clock wasn't a beeping device, but responsibility itself. 15 years as a maid had taught her that there was no room for errors or delays, and her dedication to her work was as solid as the wood of the furniture she polished daily. In the small kitchen reserved for staff, she prepared her children's lunches with the precision of someone accustomed to caring for the smallest details. She separated the fruit, sealed the juice bottles, and folded the napkins with the same care she used to prepare the sheets in the master suite. Her still sleepy children sat at the table without complaining, knowing their mother's routine left no room for distractions. "Eat everything and grab your coats before you leave. The weather might change," she said, her voice firm but always filled with affection. They nodded, aware that questioning would only delay things. The main house, just a few meters away, was already coming to life. Elizabeth descended the stairs with elegant steps, her impeccable posture reflecting her position as the matriarch of one of the city's most influential families. At 55, she maintained the same discipline that had led her to become a reference in social circles. Her watchful gaze swept the room as she discreetly adjusted a vase of flowers, demonstrating a perfectionism that admitted no flaws. She took pride in her home and, even more, in the staff she managed with a firm hand. She was never one to allow informalities, but she knew how to recognize good work when she saw it. And Maria, with her silent efficiency and unquestionable dedication, was proof that loyalty and commitment still existed. Crossing the hall, Elizabeth paused for a moment when she saw Sophie sitting on the sofa, her eyes fixed on a small notebook. The 11-year-old girl possessed a curious gaze and a sharp intelligence for her age. She visited her grandmother on weekends, and since her grandfather had passed away, made sure to keep alive the teachings he had cherished. He used to say that honesty was the most valuable asset anyone could carry, and Sophie took it as a mantra. Always attuned to what was happening around her, she absorbed every detail of adult conversations, not out of gossip, but because she believed that understanding the world was the best way to do the right thing. Elizabeth approached and smoothed a stray lock of hair from her granddaughter's head, a rare gesture of affection for someone who always maintained a firm demeanor. "Have you had breakfast?" she asked, taking a cup of coffee discreetly brought by one of the staff. Sophie nodded, her eyes not leaving the notebook. "I'm writing down Grandpa's rules," she said, flipping through the pages scribbled with small phrases that echoed the late patriarch's words. "Rules?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, curious. "Yes. He always said there are 3 rules to never get lost in life," Sophie explained with the seriousness of someone far beyond her years. "First, always tell the truth, even if it hurts. Second, never ignore something wrong, even if it's not your problem. Third, protect those who can't defend themselves." Her grandmother observed her granddaughter for a moment, surprised by the precision of the words. It was impossible not to recognize the impact her late husband had had on the girl. Sophie carried his values with an impressive conviction, something Elizabeth admired, but also knew could bring challenges in the future. The world wasn't always as simple as a set of rules. "Your grandfather was a very upright man," she said, taking a sip of coffee. "But I hope you understand that sometimes things aren't black and white. There are situations where the truth can be complicated." Sophie frowned, reflecting on that. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do the right thing, does it?" Elizabeth sighed, realizing that discussing this with her granddaughter would be futile. Sophie was too determined, and as much as life experience told her that things were more complex than the girl believed, a part of her hoped Sophie would never lose that purity. As the two conversed, Maria discreetly passed through the hall, carrying a stack of freshly laundered towels. Her presence was almost imperceptible, but her efficiency was evident in every well-tended detail of the house. With a quick glance, she checked if the sofa cushions were aligned, if the marble gleamed without fingerprints, and if the crystals on the side table were in their proper place. It was this level of dedication that had kept her there for so long, even when the demands seemed excessive. Sophie observed Maria for a moment, reminded of something her grandfather used to say about hard-working people. "The real jewels of a house are not the diamonds or the expensive paintings, but the people who make it run every day. The girl smiled at the maid, who responded with a discreet nod before heading to the laundry room. Outside, the sound of a large car pulling up at the entrance announced that Maria's children were ready to leave. Maria hurried out to ensure they were well bundled before getting into the vehicle that would take them to school. "Be polite, pay attention in class, and no running in the halls," she reminded them, adjusting one of their hoods. The boys nodded, accustomed to their mother's recommendations. Elizabeth watched the scene from the veranda, holding the coffee cup between her hands. She knew how to recognize an exemplary employee when she saw one, and Maria was the kind of person any employer would be lucky to have on their team. Always punctual, discreet, dedicated. There had never been a single complaint about her behavior, and Elizabeth knew her household ran better because of her. Sophie continued flipping through the notebook, lost in her thoughts. Her childish mind still did not know that soon the values she so admired would be put to the test in a way she never imagined, and that the house she so regarded as a symbol of order and stability was about to become the epicenter of a scandal that would change everyone's life forever. The mansion had always been the stage for sophisticated gatherings, where the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers reflected the impeccable smiles of the women parading through its halls. It was a carefully maintained environment, where every detail mattered, and every piece had its place. Elizabeth made a point of receiving guests well, and her best friend, Victoria, was a constant presence at these gatherings. Tall, elegant, and always enveloped in striking perfumes, Victoria was known for her eccentricity. At 50 years of age, she had the gift of turning any conversation into a spectacle, gesturing with her hands adorned with flashy rings and laughing exaggeratedly, as if every story she told were a masterpiece of entertainment. Sophie had never paid much attention to these gatherings, preferring to take refuge in some corner of the house with a book or her notebook. But lately, something was bothering her, small details that, for anyone else, would have gone unnoticed. It began with a music box that always sat on the hallway sideboard. It was a delicate piece, a gift from an old friend of Elizabeth's, and Sophie loved to turn the small key to hear the soft melody that echoed through the space. One weekend, when she looked for the box in its usual place, she realized it had vanished. She asked her grandmother about it, but Elizabeth only frowned, as if she couldn't remember where she might have left the piece. "Perhaps someone put it away for cleaning and forgot to put it back," she said, dismissing the matter. Sophie found it strange but didn't insist. A few days later, during another party, she noticed that her grandfather's silver key holder, which had always been on the desk in the study, was also no longer there. And once again, no one seemed to notice or care. The servants had strict rules about not touching anything without permission, and Sophie knew her grandmother wasn't the type to misplace things. But then, what was happening? The only common thread between these events was that Victoria was always nearby. Observing her grandmother's friend with more attentive eyes, Sophie noticed small gestures she hadn't noticed before. Victoria used to slide her hands over the furniture, touch objects, examine them with interest before returning them to their place. But what if she didn't always put them back? That afternoon, as the party unfolded, Sophie remained seated in a corner of the main room, seemingly distracted by a book, but actually watching Victoria out of the corner of her eye. She saw when the woman picked up a small crystal statuette from a shelf and twirled it between her fingers for a few seconds. When she lowered her hand, the piece was no longer there. Sophie blinked, uncertain if she had really seen what she thought she had seen. Maria, on the other hand, didn't get involved in these details. As a chambermaid for so many years, she knew her only priority was to keep her job. She had no time for gossip or suspicions. Her focus was to ensure that everything was impeccable before and after each event. While the guests toasted with fine crystal glasses and conversed about their travels and investments, Maria circulated through the house, checking for fingerprints on polished surfaces, collecting forgotten glasses, and ensuring that the newer staff were performing their duties correctly. Over the years, she had learned to be invisible when necessary. She knew that people like Victoria rarely noticed the presence of servants unless they needed something. For Maria, this was an advantage. The less she was perceived, the less risk she ran. She couldn't afford to make mistakes, as every cent of her salary went towards supporting her children. Her life depended on this stability, and any problem meant putting her family at risk. So when Sophie approached her in the kitchen, her face etched with unease, Maria simply smiled slightly and continued arranging the trays on the counter. "Maria, have you noticed that some things are disappearing?" the girl asked, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. Maria paused for a moment, thoughtful, but soon returned to work. "The house is big. Sometimes things get moved and then show up again," she replied with the calm of someone who had heard all kinds of stories over the years. "But I'm not talking about things that reappear," Sophie insisted, frowning. "I'm talking about things that actually disappear. The music box, Grandpa's key holder, and now I saw Victoria taking a statuette." Maria cast a quick glance at the girl, assessing her expression. She knew Sophie wasn't the type to make up stories, but she also knew that getting involved in something like that was dangerous. "That's none of our business, dear," she said softly, stacking clean plates. "My job is to make sure the house keeps running, and yours is to worry about playing and studying." Sophie crossed her arms, dissatisfied with the response. "Grandpa used to say that ignoring something wrong makes us part of the problem," she muttered. Repeating one of the teachings she knew, Maria sighed, feeling a pang in her chest at seeing how seriously this girl took her grandfather's words. But experience had taught her that for people like her, defying the rules was a risk she couldn't take. "Life isn't always like your grandfather said," she replied gently. "And sometimes, knowing when not to get involved is what keeps us safe." Sophie didn't respond, but the determined glint in her eyes showed that this conversation hadn't convinced her. Something was wrong in that house, and if no one else wanted to see it, she would have to find out on her own. The mansion was at its utmost splendor that night. The shimmer of the chandeliers reflected off the decorated walls, and the soft sound of a string quartet spread through the main hall, mingling with the murmur of the guests. The event brought together high society, and Elizabeth, as always, made sure that everything was impeccable. Her elegant dress and firm posture made it clear that this was her house and that nothing escaped her control. But while the guests toasted and laughed amidst the luxury of the night, something hung in the air, invisible to most, but clear to those who watched closely. Sophie was seated discreetly in an armchair near the main staircase, her eyes attentive to the movement of the room. Since she had begun to notice objects disappearing, she tried to pay closer attention to every detail, seeking something that would confirm her suspicions. Her notebook rested on her lap, but instead of writing, she only clutched the cover between her fingers, anxious. Victoria was there again, moving through the hall with her flamboyant presence, greeting guests with exaggerated smiles and calculated gestures. But Sophie wasn't looking at her affability or her enthusiastic stories. She was watching her hands, the quick movements, and the subtle way her fingers brushed against the objects around her. This time, however, Victoria seemed restless. Her eyes frequently scanned the room, as if looking for something or someone. Sophie noticed that the woman was constantly fiddling with her own bracelet, a tic she didn't usually have. Something was different, and the girl felt a chill down her spine. Victoria knew she was being watched. Upstairs, Maria was finishing her last task before ending her shift. As usual, she was organizing Elizabeth's jewelry in the safe embedded in the master suite's closet. The sparkle of the diamonds and emeralds reflected against the dark velvet of the boxes, each piece meticulously positioned. For her, those jewels were nothing more than objects without sentimental value, but she knew how much they meant to her employer and how careful she needed to be. Her experienced fingers adjusted the clasps, making sure everything was perfect. In the hall, Sophie continued watching Victoria, noticing that the woman now avoided touching anything. Her smiles were tense and her gestures less theatrical. Suddenly, Victoria met the girl's eyes. For an instant, the two stared at each other, and Sophie felt a chill in her stomach. The woman quickly averted her gaze, but her discomfort was evident. The wall clock showed almost midnight. The party was still lively, but Sophie knew something was about to happen, and although she couldn't yet predict what it would be, she felt that this would be the last night of tranquility in the mansion. The morning after the grand party began like any other in the mansion, but an invisible tension hung in the air. The main hall still displayed remnants of the night before, forgotten glasses on tables, chairs slightly out of place, and a faint scent of flowers mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Elizabeth, always impeccable, was already in the office reviewing the day's agenda when she decided to check the safe where she kept her most valuable jewelry, It was an almost automatic habit, a routine that reassured her. As she turned the combination and opened the heavy safe door, her eyes scanned the rows of velvet boxes inside. However, something made her pause. She frowned and leaned in a little closer, feeling a chill run down her spine. The box where she kept the family diamonds was empty. For a moment, Elizabeth tried to rationalize. Perhaps she had stored them elsewhere. Perhaps Maria had moved them as a precaution before the party. But she knew nothing was ever taken from that safe without her knowledge. Logic turned into a stab of despair as she ran her hands over the shelves, as if the diamonds could magically reappear. "Maria!" she called, her voice echoing through the hallways. The maid who was organizing the previous night's dishes in the pantry heard the urgency in her employer's tone and immediately dropped what she was doing. Wiping her hands on her apron, she hurried to the office, feeling a growing unease in her chest. "Yes, ma'am?" Elizabeth turned with a sharp look, her breathing controlled but laden with tension. "The family diamonds are missing. Did you touch the safe after you organized them yesterday?" Maria blinked in confusion. "No, ma'am, I put them back as I always do, and the safe was closed right after." The ensuing silence was broken by the sound of heels on marble. Victoria appeared at the door, elegant as ever, but with a worried expression, as if she already knew something was wrong. "Darling, what happened?" she asked, leaning in slightly, showing genuine interest. Elizabeth sighed, massaging her temples. "The diamonds are gone." Victoria's eyes widened in shock, then exchanged a lingering look with Maria before letting out a sigh laden with sorrow. "That's terrible. But considering the circumstances, are you sure no one on the staff could be involved?" Maria felt the impact of those words like a punch to the gut. The insinuation was clear, and although she tried to keep her expression neutral, she felt a chill run up her spine. Elizabeth hesitated. She had known her staff for years, but the weight of Victoria's implied accusation hung over her. "I don't want to believe that, but—" She stopped, taking a deep breath. "I'll have to verify." The atmosphere in the mansion changed in a matter of minutes. The news spread among the staff like wildfire, spawning a silent fear. Maria remained still as her belongings were inspected, feeling vulnerable in a way she had never imagined. Each drawer opened, each piece of clothing searched was an invasion that made her dignity crumble. And then, when one of the maids opened her handbag, the air seemed to disappear from the room. At the bottom, among small personal belongings, were the missing diamonds. A heavy silence fell over the room. Elizabeth's eyes widened in disbelief, while Victoria gasped in contained surprise. Maria looked at the jewels as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mind spun, trying to process how this was possible. "No, this can't be," she murmured, her voice failing. Elizabeth took a step back, her face a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Maria, how could you?" The weight of the accusation fell upon her like a silent sentence. Maria tried to speak, but the truth, as obvious as it was to herself, seemed impossible to prove. And there, before looks that once saw her with respect, there was now only judgment. The weight of the accusation fell upon Maria like a punch to the chest. The diamonds glittered against the dark fabric of her purse, silently reflecting the light as witnesses to a crime she did not commit. The murmur of the staff, Elizabeth's rigid expression, and Victoria's falsely shocked look made the moment suffocating. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was still trying to understand how those jewels ended up there. "This doesn't make sense." Her voice came out trembling, almost inaudible. Elizabeth remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the scene, as if she needed a few more seconds to accept what was before her. "I trusted you, Maria. For years you were part of this house. How could you betray that trust?" Maria opened her mouth to respond, but realized that any word would be useless. The judgment had already been decreed. Her impeccable record, her loyalty, everything dissolved before the accusation. Shame burned her skin as she felt the heavy gazes upon her. It was then that one of the house's security guards appeared at the door, alerted by the commotion. Victoria, still maintaining her concerned friend stance, cast a meaningful glance at Elizabeth. "I think you have no choice, dear. This is a crime. It needs to be treated as such." Maria's stomach churned at the word crime. Never in her life had she imagined someone would use that term to describe her. But Elizabeth's gaze, once filled with respect, was now one of pure disappointment. "Call the authorities," said the lady of the house, her voice cold and unhesitating. Maria felt her knees weaken, but refused to fall. As the staff moved away, whispering among themselves, the only thing she could think of was her children. How would they react to finding out their mother was being taken away as a criminal? Time seemed to run at a strange pace as the police arrived at the mansion. The formalities were quick. Questions, cold handcuffs on her wrists, a look of disbelief etched on Maria's face. As she crossed the front door, she felt the chill night air against her skin, but nothing could alleviate the weight she carried. The police car cut through the silent night to the station, where her identity was recorded as that of a thief. Her mind spun, trying to understand who could have done this to her, but the fear for her children's future spoke louder than any suspicion. Meanwhile, in a more humble neighborhood, the boys were about to fall asleep when their grandmother answered a call. The phone trembled in her hands, and the despair in the officer's voice on the other end made her heart stop. Within minutes, the children were awake, listening to their grandmother cry as she tried to explain that their mother wouldn't be coming home that night. The youngest of the children held her stuffed bear tightly, not fully understanding what was happening. The older one, already feeling the weight of the news, clenched his fists. "But Mum didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice choked. The grandmother couldn't answer. How could she explain something she herself couldn't accept? At the mansion, Elizabeth locked herself in the study. She ran her fingers across her forehead, feeling a throbbing headache. Her loyalty to Maria was great, but the facts were undeniable. The jewels were in her purse, and as much as she wanted to believe it was all a big misunderstanding, she couldn't ignore what she had seen with her own eyes. Victoria sat in the armchair across from her, sighing with false compassion. "You did what had to be done, Elizabeth. I know it hurts, but imagine if this had continued, if other things had gone missing. She must have been stealing for years." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. "I never had any reason to doubt her," she murmured. "That's how it works, isn't it?" Victoria said, fiddling with the shiny bracelets on her wrist. "People gain our trust until they decide to take advantage of it." Elizabeth didn't respond. Something inside her refused to accept that Maria was a thief. But in the face of the evidence, what else could she do? Upstairs, Sophie lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her fixed gaze on the ceiling reflected the storm in her mind. The day had been strange. The tension in the air, the whispers among the staff, the way her grandmother seemed dejected. When she heard Elizabeth's footsteps in the hallway, she pretended to be asleep. But as soon as the house plunged into silence, she got up and walked slowly to the door. Leaning against the stair railing, she overheard echoes of Elizabeth and Victoria's conversation. "She must have been stealing for years." The phrase repeated in her mind, making her chest tighten. Something was wrong there. Closing her eyes, Sophie tried to remember everything she had noticed in the past few days. The missing objects, Victoria's restless manner, the way the woman had stopped touching things when she realized she was being watched. And now suddenly Maria was accused of theft. The pieces began to fall into place. Her grandfather always said that the truth had a strange way of hiding, but if you paid attention to the details, it always appeared. Sophie knew Maria couldn't have done that, but how to prove it? Clutching the notebook tightly to her chest, Sophie made a decision. If no one else was going to search for the truth, she would do it herself. The school hallways seemed noisier than usual that morning. Laughter echoed from a group of children near the lockers, while others ran through the courtyard, taking advantage of free time before the start of classes. But for Maria's children, nothing seemed normal. Since the news of their mother's arrest had spread, the glances had changed. The older one walked with his head down, avoiding eye contact with his classmates, while the younger one clung to the straps of his backpack tightly, as if that could make him invisible. But nothing prevented them from hearing the whispers. "I heard their mum is a thief." Others said, "They stole diamonds. She must have been stealing for years." And others mentioned, "Do they do it too?" The older one felt his face burn with shame, but didn't react. He knew that if he answered, it would only give them more reason to mock him. The younger one, however, couldn't contain the silent tears that streamed down his face. On the other side of the courtyard, Sophie watched the scene, her chest tightening. She wanted to run up to them and tell them that everything would be okay, that it was a lie, but what could she do? If the adults didn't believe it, how could she convince cruel children who were only repeating what they heard at home? She remembered her grandfather, the deep, calm voice that always said, "Justice doesn't always appear on its own. Sometimes someone has to bring it to light." Your fingers clutched the notebook to your chest. She could not simply watch and wait for everything to resolve itself. She had to find a way to prove that Maria was not guilty. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Victoria was having coffee with Elizabeth on the veranda. Dressed impeccably, with jewels sparkling on her wrists, she held the cup delicately, as if she were a supportive friend in the face of Elizabeth's pain. "I know how you're feeling, dear. Betrayal hurts more when it comes from those we least expect," she said with a sigh. "But at least now you know the truth." Elizabeth kept her gaze distant, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. There was something uncomfortable about that conversation, but she couldn't pinpoint what. Still, Victoria was there, ever present, ever offering support. "Do you think I was too harsh?" Elizabeth asked, as if seeking some kind of comfort. Victoria leaned in slightly, touching her hand in a calculated gesture. "No, you did what needed to be done. People like that, they know how to deceive. If it weren't for chance, she could have stolen even more." Silence hung between the two, interrupted only by the soft wind swaying the curtains. Elizabeth wanted to believe she had done the right thing, but deep down, a shadow of doubt began to form. The mansion was once again illuminated to receive guests. The chandeliers glistened, reflecting the shine of the sophisticated dresses and sparkling jewelry adorning the necks and wrists of high society women. The atmosphere was the same. Soft music filled the spaces between the lively conversations. Glasses clinked in discreet toasts. However, for Sophie, there was something different about that night. Since Maria's imprisonment, the house's atmosphere had seemed charged, as if something was out of place, but no one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one wanted to notice. Seated in a discreet corner of the hall, Sophie watched Victoria move through the surroundings with her usual exaggerated elegance. Since she had started paying closer attention to her grandmother's friend, she had noticed little details that had previously escaped her. Victoria smiled at everyone, ever affable, ever engaging, but Sophie had already learned that smiles could hide intentions. She clearly remembered her grandfather's words. The real thieves hide behind smiles. He always said that when teaching her to observe people, to see beyond what was presented. That night, Sophie had an advantage. She had received a new cell phone for her birthday, a gift from Elizabeth, who believed her granddaughter needed to learn to be more independent. With it, Sophie could do something she had never tried before: record what she saw. Holding the device discreetly between her fingers, she tried not to draw attention as she watched Victoria glide between the guests. The woman gracefully picked up glasses from the waiters' trays, conversing with different groups, always maintaining an air of sophistication. But Sophie noticed something subtle. Every time Victoria approached a piece of furniture, a decorated sideboard with small valuables, her hands seemed to hesitate. Sometimes they casually passed over an object, as if she were merely admiring it, but Sophie saw the pattern. At one point, she picked up a small silver box and examined it closely. At another, her fingers slid over a gold bracelet resting on a guest's table. Nothing seemed suspicious to those not paying attention, but Sophie knew something was happening. With her heart racing, she slid off the armchair and began to follow Victoria around the hall. She kept a safe distance, avoiding the woman from noticing her presence, but always alert. Her grandmother was busy conversing with a group of businessmen, unaware of what was happening around her. Meanwhile, Victoria walked out to the garden, moving away from the crowd. Sophie hesitated for a second before following. The night was fresh, and the wind swayed the decorative lights hanging around the garden. As she discreetly stepped outside, Sophie held her phone more firmly, knowing she was about to do something that could change everything. If Maria was innocent, then the real culprit was still free, and Sophie was determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Sophie took a deep breath before quietly stepping out into the garden, her fingers gripping the phone inside her coat pocket. The fresh night air contrasted with the warmth of the hall, and the decorative lights hung between the trees cast flickering shadows along the stone path leading to the most secluded part of the mansion. Her eyes followed every move Victoria made as she slowly walked, a drink in hand, looking around as if checking if she was alone. Sophie knew she had little time. If she was right about Victoria, this could be her only chance to prove what she suspected. With light steps, She hid behind a nearby bush as the woman stopped on a bench. Holding the phone strategically, she activated the camera and pressed the record button. Feeling her heart pounding in her chest, Victoria quickly glanced around before sliding her hand into her coat pocket. When she withdrew it, she held a small gleaming brooch decorated with precious stones. Sophie immediately recognized the piece. Her grandmother had worn that brooch on several important occasions, a treasured heirloom from her mother. For a moment, Victoria simply observed the brooch, tilting it under the light to admire the shine of the stones. Then, without hesitation, she slid it into the purse she carried on her arm. Sophie could barely contain her breath. She had seen enough. The video clearly showed Victoria taking the jewelry and hiding it. Her first impulse was to run to Elizabeth and tell her what she had just witnessed. But then she hesitated. If she said something now, Victoria could deny it. She was an adult, had influence, and knew how to manipulate those around her. But Sophie was just a girl. Would anyone believe her? Those thoughts continued echoing in her mind the next day when she was at school. Sitting on a bench in the courtyard, she hugged her phone to her chest, trying to decide what to do with the recording. But her dilemmas were interrupted when she heard low sobs coming from a secluded corner of the courtyard. As she turned, her heart tightened. Maria's sons were sitting on the ground, huddled against the wall, while some older children passed by them, laughing. The youngest hid his face between his knees, his shoulders shaking with stifled sobs. The oldest kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his fists clenched tightly but said nothing. "I heard your mother is going to be locked up for years," one of the boys taunted before walking away with a cruel smile. Sophie felt a knot in her stomach. It was unfair. They were suffering for something that wasn't their fault, and the real culprit was free, frequenting the mansion as if nothing had happened. She gripped her cell phone even tighter and swallowed hard. She could keep that video to herself and pretend she hadn't seen anything. But then she remembered her grandfather's words. The truth must be told, even when no one wants to hear it. And at that moment, Sophie knew she couldn't remain silent. Sophie held her cell phone tightly as she walked towards the small house where Maria's children's grandmother lived. Her steps were quick, but her mind was a whirlwind. Ever since she had recorded Victoria taking the brooch, she had been thinking about how to reveal the truth. Telling her grandmother Elizabeth seemed like an obvious choice, but Sophie feared that Victoria would manipulate the situation in her favor. After all, the woman was a longtime friend, and until that moment, no one had even considered that she might be guilty. No, Elizabeth was not the right person to hear this. The only person who could believe her without hesitation was the boy's grandmother. She was the one suffering the most from all this, seeing her daughter behind bars and her grandchildren being ridiculed at school. If anyone needed to know the truth first, it was her. Upon reaching the house's door, Sophie took a deep breath before knocking. The sound echoed through the small hallway, and a few seconds later, the door opened. The lady appeared with a tired look, her red eyes revealing that she had probably been crying. When she saw Sophie there, she frowned, confused. "Sophie, what are you doing here, dear?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The girl hesitated for a moment, then raised her cell phone. "I need to show you something. It's about my grandmother. And about Maria." The lady's expression grew tense. She opened the door fully and gestured for Sophie to come in. The girl walked to the small sofa and sat down, holding the cell phone tightly. When the lady sat down beside her, Sophie took a deep breath and pressed play. The recording began. The image shook a little, but it was clear. Victoria was in the garden, examining the brooch for a few seconds before hiding it in her bag. The silence in the room grew heavy as the boy's grandmother watched, her eyes wide, her lips parted in shock. When the video ended, she didn't say anything. She just placed a hand on her chest and covered her mouth as if trying to hold back the sob that threatened to escape. "I knew it," she murmured, her voice choked. "I knew Maria wouldn't do that. But no one wanted to listen to me." Tears began to stream down her face, and Sophie felt a tightness in her chest. That moment confirmed that she had made the right decision. She couldn't keep that secret. The truth needed to be revealed, and this was just the first person who needed to know. The lady held Sophie's hands tightly. "Thank you, my dear. Now we need to make sure more people see this. Justice must be served." Sophie nodded, determined. It was only the beginning. The cold, cramped cell seemed to shrink with each passing day. Maria felt the weight of time slowly draining away, a silent torture that left her weaker and weaker. Her body no longer reacted the same way. The fatigue was constant and her mind was exhausted. The first nights were marked by tears she tried to hold back, but now even crying seemed to have run out. The concrete walls and the distrustful looks from the other inmates constantly reminded her of where she was. At first, she tried to keep hope, believing that the truth would come out and that someone would discover what really happened. But each new day without news, each cold look she received when saying she was innocent, further undermined her strength. The trial was approaching, and deep down, Maria no longer knew if she had the strength to fight. On the other side of the city, her children suffered as much as she did. Every night, the house that was once full of laughter and conversation became a place of suffocating silence. The youngest cried softly before falling asleep, clutching his pillow, while the older one tried to be strong, holding back his tears so as not to scare his brother. But no matter how hard he tried to stay firm, the void left by his mother's absence was something no strength could bear. Their grandmother did her best to comfort them, but even she felt that her words were just empty promises. Sophie knew this. She had seen the pain in the boy's eyes and felt the responsibility growing inside her. She held the cell phone so tightly that her fingers ached, as if the simple act of keeping the evidence with her could ensure that everything would be all right. But deep down, a profound fear tormented her. What if she lost the video? What if someone took her phone? If Victoria found out what she knew? The mere idea sent a chill up her spine. That's when she made a decision. She couldn't carry that weight alone. She needed someone she trusted completely, someone who understood the importance of the truth. And there was only one person who fit that description: Emily. Emily was her best friend since kindergarten. The two had been through everything together. And more importantly, Emily also admired her grandfather. He always said Emily was an intelligent and courageous girl, and Sophie knew she could trust her. The next morning, she found Emily at school and called her to a more secluded corner of the courtyard. Looking directly into her friend's eyes, Sophie took a deep breath and took out her cell phone. "I need to show you something, but you have to promise you'll help me," she said, and the serious tone of her voice made Emily's eyes widen. When Sophie showed the video, Emily was silent for a long time, absorbing every detail. At the end, she looked up and held her friend's hand. "This could save Maria," she said, with a firmness that Sophie did not expect. "I know, but I'm afraid." "If we lose this, we'll have nothing else," Sophie confessed, feeling tightness in her chest. Emily looked up at the sky for a moment, as if seeking strength for the words she would say next. "Your grandfather always said that the truth needs guardians. We can be those guardians, Sophie. I'll help you." The two looked at each other, knowing that they were sealing something greater than a simple promise. From that moment on, there was no turning back. Sophie passed the video to Emily, and the two made a silent pact. They would guard that secret with their lives, because they knew Maria's freedom depended on it. The morning was grey when Elizabeth entered her spacious closet, her steps echoing on the polished marble floor. The previous night had been restless. Her usually peaceful sleep was tormented by doubts that refused to be silenced. Since Maria's arrest, the house didn't seem the same. There was an emptiness in the air, something she couldn't define, but that deeply disturbed her. She tried to ignore the weight of that feeling, but as she opened one of the drawers where she kept her jewelry, a chill ran down her spine. A sapphire ring, a wedding gift from her late husband, was not where it should be. Elizabeth frowned, checking other drawers, rummaging through boxes, checking every secret compartment of the furniture. Nothing. The ring had simply vanished. Her heart raced. When the diamonds disappeared, she had been quick to accept the easiest version of events. But now another item had gone missing, and Maria was no longer there to be blamed. She took a deep breath, clenching her hands tightly on the edge of the drawer. Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Sophie remained vigilant. Since deciding to entrust the video to Emily, her paranoia had only increased. She feared that something would go wrong, that she would lose the only proof capable of saving Maria. That's why, that afternoon, the two met at Emily's house to ensure the recording was safe. Emily grabbed her phone and connected it to the computer, quickly clicking the commands to create copies of the video. "Done. Now we have backups in my email and on a pen drive. If something happens to your phone, we'll still have the proof, she said, looking at Sophie seriously. Sophie let out a relieved sigh. We need to stay alert. I can't explain it, but I feel like Victoria is becoming more and more strange. Emily frowned. What do you mean? Sophie hesitated for a moment before telling her what she had seen earlier. As she passed by the library in the mansion, she overheard Victoria talking on the phone. Her voice was more tense than usual, and Sophie, sensing something was wrong, hid behind the door and listened. I need to resolve this before the trial. Have you secured the tickets? Great. I want to leave here the same day as soon as it's all over. Sophie couldn't hear the response from the other person on the line, but Victoria's tone was hurried, like someone trying to control panic. When the woman hung up the phone, she stood still for a moment, pressing her temples and taking deep breaths, as if trying to recompose herself before returning to the main hall. Emily's eyes widened as she heard the story. She's planning to leave? Yes, right after the trial. Isn't that strange? Emily was silent for a moment before concluding, if she were calm, she wouldn't be fleeing. We need to keep an eye on her. Later, the girls had their chance. Victoria paid a visit to the mansion, as she often did, but something about her seemed different. She smiled as usual, but her eyes were restless. Sophie and Emily, hidden behind the stairs, watched her as she walked through the hall, her fingers sliding across the tabletops as if checking for something. She's looking for something, Emily whispered. Sophie nodded, feeling the adrenaline rise. For the first time, she felt they were close to exposing the truth. Now they just needed a way to make the adults believe them. The boy's grandmother rubbed her trembling hands over the scattered papers on the small kitchen table. Her tired gaze ran over each document, each formal refusal from the lawyers she had sought in recent days. The phone beside her remained silent, a symbol of the frustration growing in her chest. Since Maria had been arrested, she had not stopped looking for someone who could help her. But she always encountered the same answer: no upfront payment, no defense. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to control her breathing. Her grandchildren needed their mother. Maria could not be convicted for something she didn't do. But without a lawyer to represent her, the trial would be nothing but a cruel formality, a spectacle of false justice where the sentence was already decided. On the other side of the city, Victoria was working behind the scenes. In discreet meetings with the prosecution lawyer, she insisted the case be resolved as quickly as possible. I don't think there's any need to prolong this story, she would say with an impeccable smile as she pushed for an immediate sentence. The less time Maria had to defend herself, the better. The less room for doubt, the safer she would be. The problem was that Sophie and Emily already knew too much. That night, Sophie went to the boy's grandmother's house. Upon entering, she found the lady sitting at the table, her eyes red from exhaustion. The silence of the house weighed in the air, broken only by the sound of the clock on the wall. Sophie approached slowly, pulling up a chair beside her. If we keep waiting for a lawyer, it will be too late, she said, her voice small but firm. The boy's grandmother sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of reality. We have no choice, dear. Without a defense, Maria will be convicted. Sophie swallowed hard. Her heart was pounding, but her decision was already made. She took her phone out of her pocket and placed it on the table. Then we can't wait. We'll go straight to the judge. I have the proof. The lady blinked a few times, confused. Sophie unlocked the screen and showed the video of Victoria stealing the brooch. The images shook a little, but were clear enough to show the truth. As the video ended, the boy's grandmother covered her mouth with her hands, silent tears streaming down her face. My God, I knew it, but no one would listen to me. Sophie squeezed her hand. Now they'll have to listen. The following morning, Emily found Sophie at school, her face lit by a contagious determination. I'll be there with you in court, Emily said, holding her friend's hand firmly. You won't do this alone. We're a team. Sophie looked at her friend, feeling a warmth in her chest. The fear still existed, a shadow that stubbornly hid in the corners of her mind, but it was now smaller than her will to seek justice. With Emily by her side, she felt stronger, more prepared. The truth was on her side, and soon the whole world would know. The days leading up to the trial had passed in a whirlwind of emotions at the mansion. For the guests and high society following the story, it all seemed like just another case of justice being served. But for those who really knew what was happening, the air was charged, heavy, like an impending storm. Victoria, always impeccable before, now exhibited visible signs of wear. Her hands trembled slightly when holding the wine glass, her smiles took a second longer to form, and in the moments when she thought she was alone, her expressions revealed a growing fear. The pressure of the trial was starting to affect her. That night, Elizabeth had organized a discreet dinner for a small group of close friends. It wasn't a party, just a gathering to dispel the tensions of the week. Victoria was there, as always, but Sophie noticed something different. Throughout the night, the woman barely touched her food, limiting herself to moving the cutlery on the plate while pretending to listen to the conversations. Her fingers moved restlessly on the table, tapping lightly against the glass of the goblet, as if she couldn't relax. Sophie observed everything from her corner, keeping discreet. She had already learned that the truth was revealed in the details, and that night, Victoria was letting too many signs slip. At one point, Victoria hurriedly got up from the table, murmuring that she needed to go to the bathroom. Sophie instinctively decided to follow her. Something inside her told her that this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The mansion's corridors were silent, illuminated only by the soft light of the wall sconces. Sophie walked slowly, taking care not to be noticed. When she got close to the bathroom, she heard a muffled sound. She stopped and held her breath, leaning slightly against the half-open door. What she heard made her heart race. Victoria was crying, not contained or discreet tears, but uncontrolled sobs, as if the guilt was weighing on her shoulders. Sophie pressed her hand against her mouth, trying to contain her anxiety. "I had no choice." Victoria's voice came out broken, fragile, different from the always confident woman. "If they find out I'm done, I can't be jailed. I can't be exposed like this." There was a sound of glass hitting the sink, as if she was rummaging through something. Sophie risked peeking through a crack and saw Victoria holding a bottle of pills. Her hands were shaking as she took a pill and quickly swallowed it, as if she desperately needed something to calm her down. The girl retreated slowly, her mind spinning. She knew, Victoria knew, she was close to being discovered. And for the first time, Sophie saw something stronger than the woman's usual arrogance. She saw fear. Now she just needed to ensure that fear turned into justice. The morning after the dinner, Elizabeth woke up with an uneasy feeling in her chest. Something didn't seem right. The scene of Victoria hurriedly leaving the table, avoiding eye contact and seeming more restless than usual, kept replaying in her mind. For years she had known Victoria as a confident woman, always in control, who never let her weaknesses show. But lately her friend was different. After having her coffee, Elizabeth decided to organize the guest closet, where Victoria usually left coats and belongings whenever she spent the night at the mansion. As she opened the door, she grabbed one of her friend's wool coats to fold it, when something fell from one of the inside pockets. She frowned and bent down to pick up what seemed to be a bundle of folded papers. As she unfolded them, her heart raced. They were payment receipts from a psychiatric clinic. Victoria's name was printed at the top of the documents, and the dates were recent. The receipts indicated weekly appointments, prescription of controlled medications, and a diagnosis that Elizabeth couldn't ignore: kleptomania. She stood still for a moment, trying to process that information. The word echoed in her mind. Since the accusation against Maria, a part of her refused to believe that the maid who had served her for so many years could have actually stolen the diamonds. But if Victoria really suffered from a disorder that compelled her to steal, then what if... Elizabeth felt a chill run through her body. She left the papers on the table and brought her hands to her face, feeling naive. She had never questioned the possibility of Maria being innocent, because all the evidence was against her. But now, with those documents in hand, a new truth was beginning to emerge. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her own investigations. Still trying to put together more pieces of the puzzle, she began to search for information about disappearances of objects in other high society homes. Using her cell phone, she accessed forums and social media groups where the servants of the great mansions, often anonymously, shared strange situations that occurred with their employers. It was then that she found something shocking. In at least 3 other houses where Victoria had been a guest at parties in the last few months, There were reports of the disappearance of small, valuable objects. An emerald ring had gone missing at a well-known socialite's house, a gold bracelet had disappeared at another reception, and a ruby brooch had mysteriously vanished after a charity event. None of these cases had been thoroughly investigated, as the mansion owners, believing them to be mere misplacements, never filed formal complaints. But Sophie knew better. Each of those parties had something in common. Victoria was present. Her heart raced as she processed the discovery. Maria had never stolen anything. She had been used as a scapegoat to cover up Victoria's crimes. And if her grandmother was already starting to question the accusation, it meant that finally, the truth was about to come to light. But Sophie knew that Victoria was cunning. For years she had deceived the city's most influential people, built an impeccable reputation, and made everyone believe her word without question. If Victoria realized she was about to be unmasked, she would do anything to protect herself. She wouldn't hesitate to manipulate, distort the truth, or even blame someone else to get away unscathed. Sophie looked at the phone, her fingers gripping the device tightly. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning with all the possibilities. If she didn't act quickly, Victoria might find a way to escape, to turn the situation around once again. She took a deep breath and closed the phone. The trial was approaching, and now there was no more room for doubt or hesitation. With all she knew, she could no longer wait. The truth needed to be revealed before it was too late. Sophie and Emily were sitting in Emily's bedroom, surrounded by scribbled sheets of paper, Sophie's phone open on the bed, and a pen drive resting on the table. It was the second time they had reviewed the video and recalled each piece of the puzzle they had put together in the last few weeks. They couldn't make a mistake. The trial was coming, and this was the last chance to ensure the truth was heard. "We need to make sure no one can ignore this evidence," said Emily, biting the cap of her pen as she looked at Sophie seriously. "If we just show the video, Victoria might make up some excuse, say she was picking up the brooch to return it or something. We need to present this the right way." Sophie nodded. "My grandmother is already suspicious. If we put the pieces in the right place, she herself will realize that Victoria has been lying to her all this time." Emily took a deep breath, holding the pen drive. "I made several copies. It's in my email, on your phone, on my tablet, and also here. Even if Victoria tries to delete everything, she won't be able to." Sophie smiled, feeling a small relief for the first time. Still, her heart was heavy. Maria was still in prison, and time was running out against them. On the other side of the city, the boy's grandmother finally got permission to take her grandchildren to the prison to say goodbye to their mother before the trial. It was a painful process, full of bureaucracy and distrustful looks from the guards, but in the end the boys were able to enter and see Maria for the first time since everything happened. Maria looked more fragile than ever. Her face, once always calm and strong, now carried deep dark circles and a weariness that was not just physical, but emotional. Upon seeing her children, her eyes filled with tears, and she had to cover her mouth to contain the sob that threatened to escape. The boys ran to her, clinging to her hands through the bars separating the visiting room. "Mom, please, come home," said the youngest, his voice choked. The older one couldn't speak, only clutching his mother's hands tightly, as if he wanted to convey all the pain he was feeling. Maria swallowed hard and forced a smile to avoid frightening them further. "I'll come back, my love, I promise." The boy's grandmother discreetly wiped the tears streaming down her face. "We'll prove you're innocent, Maria. We already have the evidence." Maria shook her head, still reluctant. "I don't want you to suffer anymore because of me. If I have to pay for something I didn't do, so be it. But I don't want you to lose more sleep over this." The boy's grandmother held her hands firmly. "You taught us never to give up, Maria. Now it's our turn to fight for you." Maria closed her eyes, letting the tears flow freely. Each drop that rolled down her face carried a weight, a memory, a wound that still hurt. The time she spent away from her children, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal, the distrustful looks that haunted her even before the trial. All of it crushed her, but at the same time something inside her was trying to emerge, something stronger than the pain, the need to move forward. Deep down, she still couldn't understand how someone could do this to her. How a lie, told so easily, destroyed everything she had built over the years. She thought of all the times she woke up early to go to work, how she never took anything from anyone, how her only concern was always to secure a future for her children. And yet, she was thrown into the depths of a cell without anyone questioning whether she was really guilty. But despite everything, she felt that, somehow, she needed to forgive. Not Victoria, not Elizabeth, but herself. Because if she didn't, the anger and resentment would continue to haunt her, preventing her from starting over. "Whoever it is, I forgive them," she whispered, her voice trembling but convinced. "But I want my life back." The boys didn't wait for anything else. They ran into their mother's arms, hugging her with all their strength. Maria felt the warmth of those little bodies against hers, and in that moment, she realized that she would never again allow anyone to separate them. The grandmother nodded determinedly, discreetly wiping away the tears that streamed down her face. "Then let's bring it back to you." At that moment, the final battle was about to begin, and this time Maria wasn't alone. The courtroom was packed. The murmur of the guests echoed through the imposing hall, where the dark wooden benches gleamed in the light of the chandeliers. The tall windows let in the morning brightness, but for many present, the atmosphere seemed heavy, as if there was something weighing in the air. High society turned out in force to witness the trial that had been talked about for weeks. The case of Maria, the maid accused of stealing her employer's diamonds, had become an unmissable event for those who delighted in scandals, especially when they involved servants in a position of disgrace. Victoria entered the courtroom as if she were the true owner of the occasion. Her impeccable dress, perfectly styled hair and controlled posture gave the impression that she was there only to fulfill a protocol, as if the entire situation were just another fleeting inconvenience. But upon observing her more closely, it was possible to notice small signs of tension. Her fingers clenched and unclenched on the fabric of her dress, her hands discreetly slid over the pearl necklace she wore, and her eyes scanned the environment quickly, as if trying to measure every detail around her. Few noticed these nuances, but Elizabeth was not one of those people. Seated in the front row, the matriarch maintained a closed expression as she observed her longtime friend. Since the morning, a restlessness had been bothering her. After finding the psychiatric clinic receipts among Victoria's belongings, a growing doubt tormented her. For years, she had blindly trusted that woman, believing she knew her personality well. But now, looking at her there, something seemed out of place. Victoria discreetly brought her hand to her purse and, with a quick movement, took out a small white vial. She opened the cap and, without anyone noticing, threw 2 pills into her mouth, swallowing them with a sip of water from a bottle she had brought with her. A quick, experienced, almost imperceptible action. But Elizabeth saw. Victoria's eyes met Elizabeth's for a brief moment, and there something passed between the two of them. Not words, but a silent warning. The friend had noticed something, and Victoria knew it. The judge entered the courtroom and everyone stood up, respecting the protocol. Maria was brought in by an officer, and the impact of her appearance caused different reactions in the audience. Some whispered quietly when they saw her so dejected, her pale skin contrasting with her carelessly tied hair. For those who knew Maria only as an efficient and always discreet maid, seeing her in that position seemed unreal. Maria's children were sitting next to their grandmother, their small hands squeezing hers tightly. Sophie and Emily were nearby, silent, but their hearts pounding in their chests. The moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Elizabeth averted her gaze from Victoria and focused on the trial. She couldn't let herself be carried away by the tension in the room, but deep down, something told her that the truth that was about to be revealed would change everything. The courtroom was in absolute silence when the prosecution began to present its case. The prosecuting attorney spoke firmly, recalling the events that led to Maria's arrest and reinforcing what everyone already knew. The diamonds had been found in her purse. For many there was no room for doubt. Maria was guilty. The trusted maid, who had served the same family for years, had betrayed her mistress in an unforgivable way. In the dock, Maria remained with her head down, her trembling hands resting on her lap. The weight of the accusations was suffocating, and the humiliation of being there in front of so many people who once respected her made everything even more painful. Her children watched her from the audience, their eyes full of tears and fear, as if they were waiting for a miracle to save her. Victoria, sitting in the front row next to Elizabeth, maintained a controlled expression. From time to time, she slid her hands over her legs, an almost imperceptible gesture of nervousness. But only one person noticed the subtle signs of panic that were beginning to form: Elizabeth. The woman who had known Victoria for years felt that something was wrong. It wasn't just the tension of the trial, it was something deeper. Her friend's gaze avoided hers whenever she tried to make eye contact, and her restless fingers revealed a growing discomfort. It was at that moment that Sophie stood up, feeling her legs trembling, as if they were about to fail at any moment. The courtroom seemed much larger than it really was, and the weight of the gazes around her made her heart beat so hard that she could hear it in her own ears. Her fingers were sweaty as she gripped her cell phone tightly, as if that small object was her only guarantee that she was doing the right thing. She turned to Emily, seeking one last confirmation that she was not alone. Her friend nodded discreetly, a firm look of encouragement as if to say, "You can do it." Sophie took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them again, she felt courage explode inside her. Ignoring the growing murmur around her, she gathered momentum and ran down the central aisle of the courtroom, her shoes echoing on the polished wooden floor. With a trembling voice but filled with determination, she shouted, "Please, Your Honor, do not convict an innocent person." The entire courtroom froze. The murmuring ceased immediately, and all eyes turned to the small 11-year-old girl who, in front of a room full of adults, dared to interrupt the trial so that the truth could be heard. The courtroom froze. The murmuring ceased immediately, and all eyes turned to the girl. The judge raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the interruption, and a murmur of confusion ran through the room. Victoria remained motionless. Her eyes widened, and an involuntary shudder ran through her body. She tried to disguise it, but Elizabeth saw it. For the first time, she saw panic in Victoria's eyes. "What does this mean, girl?" asked the judge, with a serious but not harsh tone. Sophie swallowed hard and raised her cell phone. "I have proof that Maria is innocent. I filmed the real thief." An intense murmur took over the courtroom. People looked at each other, shocked by the revelation. Elizabeth, who was already beginning to doubt Maria's guilt, turned abruptly to Victoria, who remained motionless, as if her body was paralyzed. "Evidence? What evidence?" the prosecution questioned, trying to contain the confusion. Sophie took a deep breath and activated the video on her cell phone. The room plunged into absolute silence as the recording began to play on the device's screen. The image shook a little, but it was clear enough. In the first scene, Victoria discreetly took a gold bracelet from one of the guests' tables during the party. She looked around, making sure no one was watching, and quickly slid it into her purse with a swift movement. The second scene showed her examining a shiny brooch before hiding it in an inside pocket of her coat. The third image was even more damning. Victoria, now a bit more tense, looked around before taking a ring from the guest room dresser. Her fingers hesitated for a moment, but she soon slid it into her purse, quickly leaving the room. The entire courtroom watched in shock. The muffled sound of restrained reactions could be heard as those present assimilated what they were seeing. Emily, sitting in the audience, tightly held the hand of Maria's children's grandmother. The moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Elizabeth brought a hand to her mouth, eyes wide. Her breathing quickened, and her heart pounded inside her chest. She couldn't believe what she saw. Victoria, her friend of years, the woman she had defended, whom she had convinced that Maria was a traitor. She was the real guilty one. Maria, on the defendant's bench, raised her head for the first time. Her gaze was full of disbelief and emotion. Someone was finally fighting for her. The judge paused the video, breathing deeply. "Mrs. Victoria, can you explain to us what we just saw?" Victoria tried to speak, but her mouth was dry. Her skin paled and her eyes roamed the surroundings in search of an exit. Her body trembled visibly, and her hands gripped the arms of the chair tightly. Sophie, now crying, quickly wiped away her tears and continued, "I saw small objects disappear during the parties. At first I didn't know what was happening, but then I realized it always happened when Victoria was nearby. I only mustered the courage to film after Maria was wrongfully arrested." She swallowed her sobs, took a deep breath and looked directly at Victoria. The entire courtroom watched in silence, as if the air had become trapped inside that imposing room. Everyone was waiting for the reaction of the woman who, until that moment, had managed to manipulate situations in her favor. But now, there was no more escape. "My grandfather always said that the truth has to come out no matter who the person is," said Sophie, her voice still choked up but firm. "And now everyone knows who really stole those jewels." Victoria's eyes widened, her face turned pale, and for an instant, she seemed to struggle against herself. Her mouth opened, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. She tried again, but only a hoarse, trembling sound escaped her lips. The weight of the moment was overwhelming. The judge watched attentively, his eyes evaluating every move Victoria made. The prosecutor crossed his arms, while murmurs began to spread among those present. Some looked at Victoria with shock, others with contempt. Maria, sitting in the defendant's bench, kept her eyes fixed on the woman who had destroyed her life, waiting for something, anything that might come from her. Victoria gripped the arms of the chair, her fingers trembling. Sweat accumulated on her forehead, and her hands were so shaky that she seemed about to collapse. Elizabeth, sitting in the front row, noticed her friend's vacant expression. For the first time, she saw Victoria as she really was, fragile, insecure, a woman who had built her life on a lie. The courtroom's silence now seemed like a sentence even before the trial was over. The scandal was exposed. And this time there would be no way to escape. The silence inside the courtroom was suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Victoria, who seemed completely motionless, as if her brain was trying to process an impossible way out of the situation she found herself in. Her face, once so haughty and confident, was pale, her eyes wide, her lips parted as if trying to formulate a response, but unsuccessfully. Sophie still held the cell phone tightly, her breathing quickened. She felt the weight of everything she had just done, but also an enormous sense of relief. The truth was exposed for all to see. Victoria pressed her hands against the arms of the chair, her fingers digging into the thin fabric. A slight tremor began to run through her shoulders, and her lips quivered as she tried to speak. "This is an outrage," she muttered, but her voice sounded weak, unconvincing. Elizabeth, sitting next to her, said nothing. Her fixed, unwavering gaze weighed on Victoria more than any accusation from the judge. It was the look of someone who realized too late that she had been deceived for years. The prosecution called for silence in the courtroom as the judge leaned forward, observing Victoria closely. "Does the lady have anything to say about the images we just watched?" Victoria closed her eyes for a moment and swallowed hard. Her breathing was irregular, her fingers trembled, and her body seemed to be waging an internal battle. When she opened her eyes again, they were watery, as if the last barrier of her facade was about to crumble. She let out a nervous laugh, low, almost a whisper. I couldn't be arrested." The words were spoken hesitantly, but the confession, still incomplete, made the courtroom hold its breath. Victoria brought her hands to her head, her shoulders hunched, and for the first time, the mask of a sophisticated and flawless woman began to crumble before everyone. "I couldn't disgrace my family." Her voice now had a broken, anguished tone. Her eyes roamed the courtroom as if searching for some way out, but there was nowhere to run. "I was about to be discovered. Things had been disappearing for years, and I knew someone would notice eventually. If I didn't do something, my life would be over. My name and my reputation, I couldn't let that happen." The audience stirred in their seats. The murmur of shock grew among those present. Some looked at Victoria with disbelief, others with contempt. Maria felt the world spin for an instant. The humiliation, the suffering, the separation from her children, all because of a decision made by someone who wanted to save their own skin. She clenched her fists, trying to hold back the rage and overwhelming pain she felt at that moment. The prosecution called for silence again, but there was no way to avoid the impact of the confession. The judge looked at Victoria with a stern gaze before turning to Maria. "Do you have anything to say in the face of this confession?" Maria took a deep breath, her voice still choked with emotion. "I worked 15 years in that house. I never stole anything, never even thought of doing anything against Mrs. Elizabeth. And yet I was treated like a criminal, thrown in a cell as if I was nothing." Her eyes met Elizabeth's, who averted her gaze, guilt evident on her face. "I lost everything. My children suffered. My dignity was crushed. And all because someone thought my life was worth less than hers." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Victoria lowered her head, crying silently. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, her mind spinning between guilt and disbelief. The judge cleared his throat before speaking. In light of Mrs. Victoria's confession and the evidence presented, it's clear that Maria was wrongfully accused. Her sentence will be overturned immediately. Those words broke the courtroom's silence. Maria's children cried in relief, hugging their grandmother tightly. Emily squeezed Sophie's hand, who, for the first time since it all began, felt an immense weight lift from her chest. Victoria, now completely defeated, could no longer speak. The sound of the handcuffs being closed around her wrists was the only thing heard before she was taken out of the room. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tears flow. Finally, she was free. But deep down, she knew no sentence could erase what she had lived through. Elizabeth, feeling Maria's gaze on her, finally mustered the courage to look up, but all she saw was a painful emptiness. Maria just looked at her for a few seconds before turning to hug her children. The trial might be over, but the price of her mistrust would never be forgotten. The courtroom was still in shock. Victoria's words echoed in everyone's minds, mixed with the sound of the handcuffs closing around her wrists. The scandal unfolding before them was something no one could have foreseen. Victoria, the sophisticated socialite, the woman who for years had paraded among the most exclusive circles of high society, now stood before them, stripped of any mask of superiority. She sobbed uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as she tried to catch her breath. Her face was flushed, her eyes swollen, and her body trembled as if she might collapse at any moment. The woman who had always maintained an air of absolute control now seemed unrecognizable. I couldn't stop," Victoria mumbled, her voice weak and choked. "I tried to stop, but I couldn't." The judge observed the scene with solemnity, but allowed her to continue. Victoria's collapse was the inevitable conclusion of a lie she had sustained for too long. "Ever since I was young, always." She passed her trembling hands over her face, trying to contain the tears. "I've always had this urge. I didn't need the things. It wasn't about the value. It was the act of taking something without anyone noticing." Elizabeth, seated in the front row, felt a crushing weight in her chest. She could barely breathe as she watched the woman she had known for decades crumble before her. For years she trusted Victoria, defended her, laughed with her, shared secrets, believed their friendship was true. And now seeing her friend confess to being a compulsive thief, a liar, someone capable of destroying an innocent life to protect herself, she felt that everything she had experienced by her side had been a great illusion. "Did you know you were sick?" Elizabeth's voice came out low, charged with a mixture of disbelief and anger. Victoria raised her tear-filled eyes to her friend, her gaze lost, as if struggling to find an answer. "I knew." She shook her head, the sobs increasing. "I knew, but I was always good at hiding it. When things started disappearing at the parties, I thought I could control it. But then someone noticed. I saw those suspicious looks, those veiled questions. I knew they were starting to suspect." She gripped the handcuffs around her wrists, as if she felt that was her inevitable fate. And then the diamonds disappeared. But everyone was already suspecting there was a thief among us. I panicked. I thought that if someone else was accused first, I would be safe. So I framed Maria. Maria, who until that moment had listened in silence, finally raised her head. Her gaze was not one of anger, but of something much deeper, a silent pain, a sorrow that words could not express. "You destroyed my life out of fear," Maria said, her voice firm but without shouting. Victoria shrank, tears streaming down her face. I didn't think. I just wanted them to look the other way. I thought if it was quick, everything would go back to normal." "Normal?" Elizabeth repeated, the word burning on her tongue. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the woman she once called a friend. "You framed an innocent woman, destroyed a family, brought 2 children to suffering, all to save yourself. And you still want me to believe this was an accident?" Victoria closed her eyes, her sobs increasing. I know I'm a monster." She lowered her head, her whole body trembling. "But I was afraid. You don't understand what it means to be unmasked in this world, what it means to be seen as someone who has no control, someone who compulsively steals. I became a prisoner of myself, and when I saw a chance to escape, I grabbed it without thinking of the consequences. Elizabeth felt the bitter taste of disappointment in her mouth. She wanted to scream, wanted to demand answers, wanted to tell Victoria how betrayed she felt, but nothing seemed enough. Everything they had built together, every moment, now seemed like dust in the wind. You clung so tightly to this lie that you became exactly what you feared, an exposed criminal. Elizabeth's voice came out cutting, and to make matters worse, you didn't even have the courage to confess until you were forced. You not only destroyed your own reputation, Victoria, you destroyed mine too. I believed in you, I defended you. Victoria was crying uncontrollably. She knew there was no more salvation. Maria, on the other hand, remained silent. Her struggle now was not against Victoria. It was not against anyone. Her struggle was to regain her own dignity. She looked at her children, who watched everything with eyes filled with emotion, and knew that, finally, the worst was over. The judge struck the gavel against the table. Given the state of the accused and the gravity of the confession, we will suspend the trial for legal proceedings to be taken. Mrs. Victoria, you will be formally prosecuted for the crimes committed and will remain in custody while we await the next steps in your case. 2 officers approached to take Victoria away, who did not resist. There was nothing more to say. As she was escorted out of the courtroom, Elizabeth lowered her head, feeling an overwhelming weight on her shoulders. She had lost a friend, but worse than that, she had lost her own faith in her judgment of people. Maria looked at Sophie, who was still holding the phone firmly, her face marked by tears. With a small, grateful smile, she nodded. "Thank you." Sophie felt a tightness in her chest, but this time, not out of fear, but because, for the first time since it all began, she knew she had done the right thing. The courtroom was plunged into a heavy silence, as if everyone there was still processing everything that had just happened. Victoria, still handcuffed, was trembling uncontrollably, her face pale and her eyes glazed as if she couldn't believe the ruin that had just fallen upon her. Her breathing was short, erratic, and her body seemed about to collapse. The judge, maintaining his firm posture, struck the gavel against the table, drawing everyone's attention. "The court recognizes the innocence of the defendant, Maria, and orders her immediate release," he declared, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "Furthermore, this court requests a formal investigation into Ms. Victoria's conduct and her responsibility for the crimes committed." The judge's words spread through the courtroom like a wave, and the reaction was immediate. Relief overflowed on the faces of those who truly believed in Maria's innocence. Her children, seated in the front row beside their grandmother, widened their eyes and stood up instinctively, as if they wanted to run to their mother at that very moment. Victoria, on the other hand, began to breathe increasingly erratically, her hands gripping the sides of her dress as if she wanted to hold on to the crumbling reality around her. When she saw the officers approaching to escort her, she let out a trembling sigh and shook her head. "No, this can't be happening." Her knees weakened, and before she could say anything else, her body collapsed. The impact of her fall was muffled by the murmurs of the audience. Police officers and paramedics on standby rushed to assist her, checking her vital signs as the courtroom watched the scene with a mixture of shock and disdain. Elizabeth, sitting motionless in her chair, felt the overwhelming weight of shame and guilt. Her eyes were fixed on Maria, who was still seated on the defendant's bench, the handcuffs around her wrists about to be removed. A bitter sensation settled in the back of her throat. For years she had trusted Victoria, defended her word without question, while the true victim of this story suffered unjustly. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling as heavy as lead. She walked towards Maria, ignoring the looks around her, knowing she needed to do what was right. When she got close enough, she felt a lump in her throat and took a deep breath before speaking. "Maria." Her voice came out low but laden with remorse. Maria raised her eyes, her face still marked by the exhaustion and pain of the past few days. She said nothing, just waited. "I was wrong about you." Elizabeth clenched her hands, struggling to maintain her composure. "I judged you without questioning. I blindly trusted someone who I now see was never truly worthy of that trust. You served my house for years, cared for my family, were an important part of our home, and I, at the moment when I most needed to trust you, turned my back on you." Maria took a deep breath, her emotions a whirlwind. During all those days in prison, she had imagined the moment when her innocence would be proven, but she never knew if she would hear those words. "I know an apology doesn't erase what you went through, nor the suffering your children faced because of me," Elizabeth continued, her voice faltering slightly. "But I need you to know that I regret it, truly." Tears welled up in Maria's eyes, but she kept her voice firm when she replied, "I lost everything, Mrs. Elizabeth, and as much as I want to accept your words, the pain of what I lived through doesn't go away so easily." Elizabeth nodded, feeling an even tighter knot in her chest. "I know, but I hope somehow I can make amends for what I did. You deserve justice." Before another word was said, the sound of the handcuffs being removed echoed through the courtroom. Maria looked at her now free wrists and took a deep breath. It was official. She was free. It was at that moment that her children ran towards her, their little legs barely able to keep up with the speed of the emotion they felt. "Mommy!" The cry of joy echoed through the hall, and before she could prepare herself, Maria felt her children's arms around her, hugging her tightly. Her tears finally fell as she wrapped her arms around them, feeling the warmth of their small bodies against hers. "My boys." Her voice came out choked, suffocated by sobs. "I missed you so much." The audience watched the scene with a mixture of emotion and admiration. What had once been a trial had turned into a moment of pure truth and redemption. Some people who had believed in Maria's guilt now felt the shame of their hasty judgment, while others simply watched in silence, unable to process everything that had happened. Sophie and Emily exchanged glances, a smile appearing on both their lips. They had done the right thing. They had faced their fears and challenged the injustices of the adult world to ensure that the truth was heard. And now there, before their eyes, they saw the result of what they had fought to achieve. Elizabeth, still standing near Maria, looked at the reunited family and knew that, no matter how much she had been wrong, she could still try to make amends. But before thinking of any gesture of reparation, she knew she needed to let that moment belong to Maria and her children. Little by little, the courtroom began to empty. The judge announced that all formalities would be dealt with in the coming days, and that Maria was officially free to go home with her family. Victoria's case would take a different turn, and she would have to face all the consequences of her actions. Maria held her children's hands, guiding them out of the courtroom, where she took a deep breath of the fresh air of freedom. Each step she took was a step away from pain, away from fear. She didn't know exactly how she would rebuild her life from there on, but she knew one thing. She would never again let injustice silence her. Sophie ran up to her, hesitant for a moment, but Maria bent down and hugged her warmly. "Thank you, my dear. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here today." Sophie smiled, the tears still shining in her eyes. She felt her heart light, as if for the first time since the beginning of that journey, she could breathe without fear. The pain of uncertainty, the weight of doubt, and the fear of failure had been replaced by something new, the certainty that she had done the right thing. "It was my grandfather who taught me," she said, her voice charged with emotion. "He used to say that the truth always has to come out, no matter what happens." Maria looked at the girl with tenderness and deep gratitude. That child, who was not even part of her reality before, was now responsible for restoring her freedom. Her gaze was one of admiration, but also of respect. "Your grandfather was a very wise man," Maria replied, her voice charged with emotion, "and you honored every word of his." Sophie felt a lump in her throat, but managed only to smile. Emily, by her side, held her hand in a gesture of complicity, as if silently saying that she would always be there to support her. Maria then turned to Elizabeth, her gaze laden with meanings. Elizabeth held her gaze for a moment, knowing that nothing she said at that moment could change what had happened. But deep down, she hoped that one day Maria could completely forgive her. The former maid took a deep breath and, without saying anything else, turned to go her way. Her children were waiting for her home was waiting for her life finally was back in her hands. The past still hurt, but the future, for the first time in a long time, seemed promising. Every step she took away from that courthouse was a step toward a new beginning. The air outside the courthouse was fresher than Sophie had imagined. The gentle breeze ruffled her hair, but she hardly noticed. Her chest was still racing, her heart pounding hard after everything that had happened inside. She blinked a few times, trying to hold back her tears, but when she looked at Emily, she could no longer contain her emotion. "We made it," she whispered, her voice choked. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with the same mixture of relief and happiness. Then, without a second thought, Sophie threw herself into her friend's arms, and the two hugged tightly. "I thought no one would believe us," Sophie sobbed against Emily's shoulder. "But they did," Emily replied, hugging her friend even tighter. "We did what needed to be done." That hug was not just a gesture of happiness. It was a moment of relief, the end of a struggle that seemed impossible when it all began. They knew that if they hadn't been brave enough to fight for the truth, Maria would still be in prison, and Victoria would still be free, deceiving everyone. Next to them, Maria's children's grandmother watched the scene with an emotional smile. After a few moments, she approached, running her hands affectionately through Sophie and Emily's hair. "You were incredibly brave," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "My daughter is free because of you. My grandchildren will sleep peacefully tonight because you didn't give up." She looked at the two girls with profound gratitude, and her eyes shone with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. "My husband always used to say that the truth needs people to protect it," she continued, looking directly at Sophie. "And you, my dear, honored your grandfather's memory." Sophie swallowed hard, feeling a tightness in her chest. She remembered her grandfather, the firm and gentle voice with which he always told her never to turn her back on what was right. He would have been proud of her. Maria, who was still holding her children's hands, approached the group. Her gaze met Sophie and Emily, and for a moment, words failed her, as if anything she said wouldn't be enough to express what she felt. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice filled with sincerity. Sophie smiled and nodded while Emily squeezed her hand. Elizabeth, who until then had been watching the scene from afar, took a deep breath before taking a step forward. She didn't know if she should approach, if she would be welcome at that moment. But something inside her said she needed to try. Maria noticed her presence and turned slowly. The look between the two women was long, laden with something neither of them could quite describe. "I know words can't undo what happened," Elizabeth said, in a humble tone Maria had never heard from her before. "But I want you to know that I deeply regret it. I was unfair, I should have questioned, I should have trusted you, but I failed. And now, all I can do is try to make amends for that mistake." Maria folded her arms, watching Elizabeth for a few seconds. "And how do you intend to do that?" Elizabeth swallowed hard. "I want to ensure that you and your family are well taken care of. You lost your job because of me, so I want to offer you something better. I want you to have a safe home, for your children to have everything they need to start over." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me charity?" "No," Elizabeth replied quickly, shaking her head. "I'm offering justice. I can't undo what happened, but I can ensure that your future is not defined by that injustice." Maria fell silent. She thought about all the suffering she had endured, the pain of being accused by someone she respected, the humiliation of seeing her children crying every night. Nothing could erase that. But there before her was a woman who for the first time seemed truly remorseful. She took a deep breath. "I accept, but not because I need your help. I accept because I know my children deserve a fresh start. But I want to make one thing clear, Elizabeth. I never want you to doubt my character again, because I never doubted yours." Maria's words made Elizabeth feel a tightness in her chest, but she nodded, accepting that condition. "I understand," she said, her voice low. Looking around, Elizabeth saw how much her worldview had changed. Before, she had always surrounded herself with people like Victoria, believing that loyalty came from status, from social connections. But now she saw that the people who truly mattered were those who fought for the truth, regardless of the risk. She looked at Sophie and Emily, and a small smile appeared on her lips. "You two taught me a great lesson. Never ignore that sense of justice. The world needs more people like you." Sophie and Emily smiled shyly, but felt the weight of those words. They knew they had done something important, something no one could take away from them. Maria squeezed her children's hands and began to walk away. But before leaving, she looked at Elizabeth one more time. "I hope one day you can forgive yourself, as much as you want me to forgive you," she said, and then turned to leave with her family. Elizabeth remained standing, watching Maria walk away, feeling a mixture of relief and guilt. She knew she still had a long way to go to make amends for her mistakes, but at least now she had a chance to do the right thing. Sophie held Emily's hand, feeling the wind blowing against her face. The day was ending, but they knew that story would stay with them forever, and above all, they knew they had changed a family's life. Forever. The door creaked slightly when Maria opened it, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt different. It wasn't just the absence of accumulated dust, or the fact that everything was in the same place she had left it. It was the air, the feeling that she could finally breathe without fear. Her children ran ahead of her, laughing as they hadn't laughed in weeks, and threw themselves onto the worn couch as if they wanted to feel that space was truly theirs again. Maria carefully closed the door and looked around. The simple furniture, the small kitchen, her children's toys scattered in the corner of the living room. It was all so modest compared to the mansion where she had worked for so many years. But it was there in that little home that she truly felt safe. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a moment to absorb the feeling of being back. Her gaze fell on her children, and she smiled as she saw the youngest pulling his brother by the hand toward the bedroom, probably to show him a drawing he had made while she was gone. Knowing that she could finally watch them grow up without the shadow of injustice looming over them was what mattered most. While Maria was restarting her life, Victoria faced a very different fate. Admitted to a psychiatric clinic under court orders, she was completely isolated from the world she had once considered hers. The doctors evaluated her condition and confirmed the diagnosis she had long feared: severe kleptomania, accompanied by extreme anxiety crises and a pathological need for control. In the first few days, she refused to speak to anyone, locking herself in her own silence. But as time passed and the visits became non-existent, the truth hit her hard. High society, the very one she had so feared displeasing, had already forgotten her. Her name, which had once shone among the most influential, was now associated with scandal, and the people who had once flattered her no longer even mentioned her existence. While Victoria disappeared from the social scene, Elizabeth began to see the reality she had ignored for so long. The days following the trial were ones of deep reflection for her. The shock of Victoria's betrayal still weighed on her mind, but the real impact came when she began receiving calls from other high society women. Some, driven by curiosity, wanted to know details of what happened, as if her pain and humiliation were just another interesting story to be commented on at charity events. Others, however, called for a much more alarming reason. After I found out everything, I decided to check my jewels. Elizabeth, one of my diamond earrings disappeared after that party last year, one of the women said. My bracelet went missing months ago. I never wanted to believe someone had stolen it, but now I wonder if Victoria was involved, another confessed. Elizabeth listened to each account with growing horror. The thefts she thought were isolated were, in fact, much bigger than she had imagined. Victoria had been discreetly stealing for years, in small doses, taking advantage of the trust and distraction of the hosts of the parties she attended. She spent the following morning checking her own belongings and realized that some sentimental valuables were simply no longer there. It wasn't just the betrayal of a friend. It was a web of lies and manipulation built over years. Elizabeth sat on the couch in her home, feeling more exhausted than she had ever been. Her world, which she had always considered so solid and predictable, had crumbled, and now she needed to decide how to rebuild it. The morning was sunny when Maria opened the door and found Elizabeth standing there, holding a folder of documents and with an expression that mixed determination and regret. For a moment, Maria considered closing the door and pretending she hadn't seen her, but something in her chest stopped her. Taking a deep breath, she crossed her arms and leaned slightly against the doorframe, waiting for the other woman to speak first. "May I come in?" Elizabeth asked, her voice calm but weighted. Maria hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing her to enter. Elizabeth came in and looked around the small home. It was simple, cozy, but very different from the luxurious environment she was used to. She looked at Maria and realized that this woman, despite having been through so much suffering, still maintained her dignity intact. "I know I've said this before, but I'm sorry," Elizabeth began, holding the folder more firmly. "Nothing I say or do can undo what happened, but I'm here to try to correct as much as possible." Maria raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms again. "And how do you intend to do that?" Elizabeth opened the folder and placed on the table a set of papers. I want to offer you full compensation for the time you spent wrongfully imprisoned and for the damages you suffered. I want to ensure that you and your children have a new chance, without having to worry about the future." Maria looked at the papers, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, she knew the money could help her. But her mind still weighed with the memory of betrayal, of the way she was humiliated and ripped from her life, without anyone defending her. Elizabeth noticed her hesitation and continued, "And I also want to offer you your job back. But not like before. I want you to have a dignified position where your loyalty and hard work are recognized. I'm not asking you to go back to the same situation, but to accept a new beginning." Maria remained silent for a long time, reflecting. She had fought to gain her freedom, to be heard. Elizabeth's offer was generous, but it also came loaded with a guilt that no amount of money in the world could erase. "I accept the compensation," she finally said, her voice firm. "But I don't want my job back. I spent years serving your family, and at the moment when I needed it most, I was discarded. I want something new, something of my own." Elizabeth nodded slowly, respecting her decision. "Then, if there's anything else I can do for you, tell me." Maria took a deep breath and looked at her children playing in the backyard. "I want my story to serve as an example. I want people to know what happened, and for it to never happen again." Days later, the high society social circle began to move in a different way. The scandal involving Victoria caused many people to reflect on how they had judged Maria without concrete evidence. Some of the women who had previously treated her with suspicion now sought ways to make amends for their mistakes. At the club where they used to gather, a group of socialites discussed over glasses of tea and dainty biscuits. "If we were so quick to point the finger," said one of them, shaking her head, "if someone had told us the truth before, would we have acted differently? Perhaps. But what matters now is that we know," another responded. The conversation reflected what happened in the following weeks. Elizabeth made sure that all influential people learned what had happened and that Maria was treated with the respect she deserved. At the supermarket, at her children's school, on the streets, Maria began to notice different looks, no longer of suspicion, but of remorse. Some people directed timid words of apology to her. Others, still ashamed, merely lowered their heads as they saw her. But for Maria, that was enough. Meanwhile, Sophie was becoming a small celebrity among her schoolmates. In the schoolyard, students talked about her courage, about how she had faced a courtroom full of adults to tell the truth. Teachers proudly commented on how she was an example of justice, and even the older students began to see her with admiration. On a special morning, the principal organized a simple but meaningful ceremony. She called Sophie to the front of the school, where all the students were gathered. By her side, Emily smiled, knowing that her friend deserved this recognition. "Sophie taught us that justice has no age," said the principal, looking at the girl. "That sometimes adults make mistakes, but there's always room for the truth to prevail. On behalf of the school, we'd like to honor her for her courage and commitment to doing what's right." Sophie blushed, holding the small medal she received as applause echoed through the schoolyard. Her eyes met Emily's, who hugged her as soon as she came down from the stage. "You're amazing," said Emily, squeezing her hand. "I couldn't have done this without you," Sophie replied, smiling. Later, as she walked home, Sophie felt the gentle breeze on her face and looked up at the sky. She remembered her grandfather's words, the lessons he had always taught her about honesty and justice. She knew that in the end, she didn't need a medal to know she had done the right thing. But somehow it was good to see that the world also recognized it. Upon learning of the tribute, Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest. For the first time, she understood the true meaning of what Sophie and Emily had done. They had not only saved Maria, they had taught everyone a lesson that could never be forgotten. The days that followed brought a new rhythm to the lives of Maria and her children. For the first time in a long while, their routine was no longer marked by the weight of uncertainty or the fear of what would come next. It was a fresh start, one that still carried scars, but also brought the hope of a better future. When the boys returned to school, there was a certain apprehension in the older one's eyes. He still remembered the bullying, the whispering, the cruel laughter. But as he entered the schoolyard, he noticed something different. There were no more whispers of accusation. Instead, his classmates greeted him normally, some even apologizing shyly. The principal called them into his office and ensured that from then on, no one would ever mock them again. The younger one, who had previously been isolated, was invited to play during recess. For the first time since his mother had been arrested, he accepted without hesitation, laughing like any other child his age. The childhood that had been stolen from them was slowly returning, and Maria knew that was the most important thing. Meanwhile, Sophie and Emily were closer than ever. What they had gone through together had created an unbreakable bond between them. The fear, the doubts, the weight of responsibility they had assumed, all of that only strengthened their friendship. Now, as they walked through the school hallways, they felt a new kind of respect from their peers. "Have you ever thought about what you want to be when you grow up?" Emily asked, as the two shared a snack during lunchtime. Sophie smiled and looked up at the sky, pensive. "I think I want to help people. Maybe a lawyer, like the judge that day. Or a journalist to tell the stories no one wants to hear." Emily nodded enthusiastically. "Then I'll be your partner. Who knows, we might solve mysteries and fight for justice together." The two laughed, but deep down they knew that promise had a true meaning. Maria, in turn, was beginning to feel that the storm was finally passing. With Elizabeth's compensation, she was able to rent a larger house where her children had space to play and study in peace. She decided not to go back to work as a domestic worker, but found a new opportunity in a community center, helping women who, like her, had gone through injustices and needed support to start over. At night, as she put her children to bed, Maria watched them for a moment, listening to the calm breathing of each one. The trauma wouldn't disappear overnight, but they were together, they were safe, and that was all that really mattered. The days turned into weeks, and the repercussions of Maria's case still echoed through high society. Elizabeth, now aware of the past's mistakes, realized that she needed to do more than just apologize. Her way of managing the mansion and dealing with the staff needed to change. It was not enough to simply repair the wrong committed against Maria. It was necessary to ensure that no other injustice happened within her home or any other family that employed dedicated and hard-working people. On a sunny morning, Elizabeth gathered her staff team in the mansion's great hall. The atmosphere, once marked by rigid hierarchies and respectful silence, now carried a new energy. She looked at each of the faces, watching her attentively, noticing for the first time how much she had never cared to truly know them. "I want everyone to know that changes will be made from now on," Elizabeth began, her voice firm but serene. "What happened with Maria made me realize that I have never valued you as I should. You all work every day to keep this place running, and I failed to ensure that you were treated with respect and dignity." The staff exchanged surprised looks, as they had never heard those words from their employer's mouth. Elizabeth continued, "From today on, everyone will have formal contracts and salaries commensurate with their work. No accusation will be made without concrete evidence, and none of you will be treated as disposable." Elizabeth's decision did not remain just within her home. Maria's case served as an example for many other high society families, and soon meetings began to be organized among the city's most influential employers. Inspired by what had happened, Elizabeth suggested the creation of a committee to regulate the treatment of domestic workers, ensuring that everyone had rights and security at work. The impact was immediate. Gradually, the culture of mistrust that had always hung over employees began to dissipate, and a new standard of respect was established. Meanwhile, Maria was on her own journey of transformation. Even after refusing the old job at Elizabeth's mansion, she was surprised by an unexpected offer. The community center where she had started working recognized her dedication and offered her an administrative position, something that would give her more stability and a more active role in helping other women. On her first day of work, Maria entered the simple yet welcoming office and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. For the first time, she wasn't serving anyone. She was there to help, to make a difference in the lives of people who, like her, had been victims of injustice. Meanwhile, Sophie was also undergoing her own transformation. After everything she experienced, the way she saw the world changed. If, before she was just a curious girl, now she carried within her a certainty that few children had. The truth needed to be defended, no matter who was against her. At school, she became interested in debates and reading about justice, inspiring other classmates to also question and always seek the truth. She realized that Even though young, her voice had power. And if she managed to change Maria's life, she could change much more in the future. The cycle of injustice that once surrounded her was unraveling. Now each of them followed a different path, but they all carried with them the lessons of that event. The past could not be erased, but the future was being shaped in a completely new way. The changes implemented by Elizabeth were not restricted to her mansion. After reformulating the way she treated her employees, she realized that the injustice against Maria was not an isolated case. If that happened within her own home, how many other high society families had also committed similar mistakes? How many people were accused without evidence simply because they were in a vulnerable position? Determined to do more, Elizabeth gathered a group of influential employers and proposed the creation of an assistance fund for wronged domestic workers. The idea was to ensure that any employee arbitrarily accused had access to legal representation, preventing more innocents from being punished for crimes they did not commit. Additionally, the fund would offer financial support for those who needed to get back on their feet after being fired without justification. At a major charity event held at the mansion itself, Elizabeth took the stage to officially present the project. The hall was filled with businessmen, lawyers, and important figures of society. She held the microphone and took a deep breath before speaking. For years I lived believing that I was fair and always made the right decisions, but recently I was confronted with the fact that my trust and judgment were misguided. I accused an innocent woman, condemned her without evidence, and destroyed her life because I preferred to believe someone from my social class instead of seeking the truth. Today I publicly take responsibility for my guilt and commit to preventing other injustices like this from happening. There was silence in the audience. Many of those present still saw Elizabeth as a reference, and hearing such words from her mouth was surprising. But she continued, "I am creating an assistance fund to ensure that no one else is punished for a crime they did not commit, simply because they do not have money to defend themselves. The employees who work in our homes deserve more than just a salary. They deserve respect, rights, and the chance to prove their innocence if unjustly accused." The proposal was received with enthusiasm by many and skepticism by others. But one thing was undeniable. Elizabeth was determined to correct the mistakes of the past, and this time no one could ignore the truth. Meanwhile, Sophie was also doing her part to ensure that the lesson of that episode was not forgotten. At school, she was invited by her teacher to share her experience with the class. At first, she felt a chill in her stomach, but she knew she had to speak. "When it all started, I was just a little girl who saw the wrong things happening and thought I couldn't do anything. I saw someone being unjustly accused and I was afraid to get involved. But then I remembered what my grandfather always said, the truth only needs one person to be heard. And I decided I couldn't stay quiet anymore. The room was silent, all students attentive to every word. I knew it could go wrong. I could be ignored, no one could believe me, but I had to try. If it weren't for me and Emily, Maria would still be in prison." There was a murmur in the class. Some looked at Sophie with admiration. Others seemed to reflect on her words. "So if any of you ever see something wrong happening, if you realize that someone is being treated unfairly, don't stay silent. It may be difficult, it may be scary, but the truth needs people to defend it, and any one of us can be that person." The teacher smiled and clapped, followed by all the students. Sophie felt a warmth in her chest. For the first time, she understood that her story was not just about Maria. It was about something bigger, something that could change the way people saw justice. And at that moment, she knew that this was only the first of many truths she would help reveal. Days passed, and little by little, the weight of the past was replaced by new perspectives. Maria and her children's suffering could not be erased, but now they had something that once seemed impossible: security and stability. Visits to Elizabeth's house became frequent, not as employer and employee, but as two women who in different ways had learned to see the world beyond appearances. Maria's children played in the mansion's garden without fear, welcomed with affection by Elizabeth, who made sure they always felt welcome. For her, this interaction was her way of making amends for the past, but also something she genuinely came to value. Maria, in turn, began to assist Elizabeth in the new project to support wronged employees. Her experience gave her authority to speak with other people who had gone through similar situations. In a short time, her presence became essential in meetings, showing that her story was not just a mark of the past, but a drive to change the lives of many. Meanwhile, Sophie and Emily were closer than ever. After everything they had been through together, they knew their friendship was more than just playtime and shared secrets. They had become partners in something much bigger, the fight for truth. On a quiet afternoon, the two were sitting under the shade of a tree in the schoolyard, books scattered around, when Emily looked at Sophie with a determined smile. "Do you know what you want to do in the future?" she asked, biting her pencil while scribbling in her notebook. Sophie looked at the sky for a moment, pensive. "I think I want to study law. I want to make sure people like Maria never go through what she did again." Emily smiled, nodding. "Me too. We can study together, be lawyers, fight for the innocent." Sophie laughed, excited at the idea. "Yes, and if we have our own firm, we can solve important cases. Who knows, we might even get famous." Emily shook her hand, sealing the promise. "Then it's decided. We're going to change the world together." The wind blew gently, bringing with it the feeling of new beginnings. The two knew the path would not be easy, but they were certain that no matter what happened, they would always fight for what was right. And at that moment, under the shade of that tree, a new story began to be written. A year had passed since the trial and much had changed. Maria, who had once been unjustly accused and humiliated, now walked the halls of Elizabeth's mansion with a firm and confident look, but this time not as a maid. After months of Elizabeth's insistence on reconciliation to correct the past mistakes, she now provided consulting for the staff team, as she did in other mansions and other locations, a position that gave her authority and recognition for her work. Elizabeth kept her promise to reform the house structure, ensuring that all employees were treated with respect and dignity. Maria had become an active voice to ensure that no one went through what she did. Everyone knew that under her consultancy, any injustice would be taken seriously. Her children had also recovered. The youngest no longer carried fear in his eyes, and the eldest, once so withdrawn, now laughed with his schoolmates. The trauma of the past had not been erased, but it had been overcome with the love and security that Maria fought to guarantee. They could sleep peacefully, knowing that their mother was there, free and strong as ever. Meanwhile, Victoria followed a very different path. Admitted to a psychiatric clinic to treat her kleptomania and anxiety disorders, she was far from the life of luxury and power she so cherished. The scandal she caused still echoed in high society, and many of her former friendships abandoned her, preferring to pretend they had never known her. The days inside the clinic were long and monotonous, marked by constant therapy and medication. Without parties, without jewels, without being able to manipulate those around her, Victoria found herself forced to face who she really was. The treatment was difficult, but necessary. For the first time, she had to admit to herself that she had spent her life running from the truth. The mansion was specially illuminated that night. The garden, decorated with soft lights and well-set tables, was filled with guests chatting animatedly. But unlike the high society parties held there in the past, this was not a celebration of empty ostentation. It was a night of recognition, gratitude, and change. At the center of the event, Maria walked among the guests, this time as a respected and recognized woman. Many came to greet her, congratulating her on her strength and resilience. Some old acquaintances from society still carried embarrassed looks, for they had judged Maria without questioning the facts. But she bore no resentment, only pride for having overcome everything and being there with her head held high. On the stage set up in the garden, Elizabeth took the microphone and waited until everyone fell silent. Her gaze swept over the faces of those present before she began to speak. "Tonight is not just a celebration, but an important milestone," she said, her voice firm. "In recent months, I have learned more about justice and responsibility than in my entire life. And I realize that we often look in the wrong direction when seeking the truth." The silence in the garden was absolute. "That's why today, I officially announce the creation of a charitable foundation aimed at supporting unjustly accused employees and ensuring they have access to proper defense. No one who works honestly should go through what Maria went through. And I commit to ensuring that this never happens again under my supervision." The applause was immediate. The impact of that initiative was enormous, not only for the employees present, but for everyone who understood the weight of that promise. When the applause ceased, the city's mayor took the stage with an envelope in her hands and smiled at the audience. Before we end this special evening, we have one more important moment. We want to honor a young woman who proved that courage and justice have no age. If it weren't for her, Maria might still be behind bars. This Medal of Honor is awarded to Sophie for her bravery and commitment to the truth. Sophie's heart raced when she heard her name. Emily squeezed her hand with a wide smile, encouraging her to go up on stage. With shaky legs, Sophie walked up to the mayor, who handed her a small, shiny, golden medal under the party lights. When she turned to look at the audience, she saw the pride in her parents' eyes, in Emily's, in Maria's, and most importantly, in Elizabeth's, who smiled sincerely. Sophie took a deep breath before speaking into the microphone. I never imagined all of this would happen. At first, I just wanted to understand what was going on, but I learned that sometimes telling the truth can be difficult, especially when no one wants to hear it. But my grandfather always told me that the truth needs to be told, even when it's hard. The applause echoed through the garden, and Sophie felt a warmth in her chest. That night was not just about the past, but about what was yet to come. The future finally seemed to be on the right track. The next day, the wind blew softly through the trees of the small cemetery, swaying the dry leaves scattered on the ground. The morning sun cast a golden light over the well-kept gravestones, creating a serene and peaceful environment. Sophie walked slowly along the stone path, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. By her side, Emily accompanied in silence, respecting the moment. When they reached Sophie's grandfather's grave, she knelt down and gently ran her hand over the name engraved on the cold stone. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a mixture of longing and gratitude. "Hi, Grandpa," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "A lot has happened since the last time I was here. I wanted to tell you that I did what you always taught me. I defended the truth even when it seemed impossible." She placed the flowers on the gravestone and smiled slightly. "It was hard. Many times I was afraid of being wrong, of no one believing me. But I remembered your words, how you said the truth always needs to be told no matter what happens." Emily knelt down beside her friend, gently touching her shoulder. "And you did it. You saved a life, Sophie. Your grandfather would be so proud." Sophie sighed, looking up at the blue sky above them. "I still miss him every day, but I know he'll always be with me in everything I do." They remained in silence for a moment, hearing only the sound of the wind through the trees. Then, Sophie turned to Emily with a determined gleam in her eyes. "I know I'm still young, but I want to keep doing this. I want to study, learn more about justice, and make sure no one else goes through what Maria went through." Emily smiled and squeezed her hand. "Then let's do it together. Let's study law, open an office, and fight for what's right, always." Sophie smiled, feeling her heart light. "Always." The two stood up, took one last look at the gravestone, and began to walk back. Her grandfather's legacy was now part of her own story, and she was ready to continue writing the future he would have wanted for her. If Maria and Sophie's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and check out the story appearing on the screen now, specially chosen for you. See you soon.